All right. We're good.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being on this call and video today. I will say as a caveat, I'm State Superintendent Chris Reykdal. There is still some construction going on outside of our building. It is a project that has moved forward from the city of Olympia, so you may get a little bit of feedback there and occasionally a little bit of noise, but we'll push through that, and hopefully that won't be too poor for the audio quality on your side. Again, I thank you for being a part of this. A couple weeks ago, we held a media availability to answer questions for you all as OSPI and the K-12 system moves through and navigates the COVID-19 situation and our continuous learning expectations. We want to do these periodically to give you an update, make sure we can answer your questions. Mostly what I want to cover today is a student grading policy that we issued yesterday evening, and also make available to the media questions on that and really anything related to the COVID-19 response, how continuous learning is going, and kind of maybe what we see moving forward here. So you can certainly ask questions as I'm done wrapping up here via that as you consider what has transpired in the last couple of weeks. I would remind everybody that it was just 2 weeks ago that the governor ultimately shut down our K-12 public and private schools in the state of Washington for the duration of the year. His proclamation prohibits traditional face-to-face instructional learning and recreational activities. We have had questions about WIAA athletics moving forward, and those are consistent with the learning in that they will not proceed this year. The context for all of us is what's happening globally. There are multiple citations of between 1.5 and 1.6 billion children around the planet not being in their traditional education models. 53 million students across the United States not in traditional school. All schools are closed now, and more than half of the states have already made the decision to close their schools for the rest of the year. So there's a lot of conversation about how does learning move forward and are we losing ground? And I always want to be really clear with that we were a state very early on that made the decision to have continuous learning expectations. So by March 30th, districts were engaged in that, and they've all ramped up at different speeds and paces depending on their resources and the connectivity of families. They are all involved in those activities now, and the build out of technology for individual students and families is improving, and the connectivity, but there are still clear gaps there and processes to try to make those connections. We are also a state now, based on guidance we sent out yesterday, that's made a statewide policy framework around grading. I take pretty seriously my role here to generally yield to local decision making where the clear authority is theirs. Occasionally in statute, the authority is with OSPI to make statewide decisions and statewide accountability decisions. And the transcript and what a credit is in this larger question of how to evaluate student learning with the statewide policy framework is with us. And so we got a lot of feedback over the last several weeks as continuous learning went on. A question kept emerging from the field. Our educators and our administrators, like, what is the grading policy? Because one district's doing this, and another one's doing something very different, and the district next door is doing something entirely different. I want to thank our partners in higher education. They've worked hard. They're in the same situation navigating this as they go. They made some very clear expectations of flexibility around resident undergraduate admissions because so many questions of GPA and grading were emerging. They were also really honest, though, in their communication with K-12 that they can't speak for admissions into upper division major programs or graduate school or out-of-state colleges and universities or NC2A athletic requirements or scholarships in particular. So there was still a lot of concern around whether or not a grading system needed a little more state policy framework. We talked to lots of superintendents. Our statewide calls were very abundant over the last 2 weeks. I did a video last week challenging folks to reach out to me directly, and I got an incredible volume of response, incredibly compassionate and without question complex responses. People were all over the board, from grading policies to no grading to other models. There was no consensus from that either, but enough that we could draw out of each of the major perspectives their interests. And so we have crafted and landed on a grading policy. I want to start by putting a screen up here for your consideration. which contextualizes where we would normally be in the state of Washington if this were a regular year. If we had not had COVID-19, our students were in their buildings right now, we get a snapshot periodically of what those grades might have looked like in a traditional spring quarter, so second semester of the year, or third trimester if you're in a trimester system. Our state has different models, as you might imagine, on how they grade, but we get a really good data set on what those grades might have looked like in a normal year. And there's a distribution to that. And we'll be bringing that up here in a way that I can actually see it with you. And so hopefully on your screen you see that now. This is last year, 2019 spring grades of all the high school credits offered. So this is our 9th through 12th graders, but also some of our middle school students who take high school credit level coursework. This is the distribution of all those grades, nearly 39% with A's, 22% with B's, 15% with C's, and you can see that distribution as it goes down. This context is really important because there's a lot of folks who might think of it as a bell curve traditionally, and it's not, because more and more districts have moved to a standards-based grading. They are objectively, increasingly objectively analyzing student performance against standards. So are they exceeding standards, meeting standards? Are they approaching standards? Are they really struggling? And so this distribution makes a lot of sense in that regard. We have a pretty remarkable student body in the state of Washington using NAEP scores, National Assessment of Educational Progress. We have a pretty good indication that we're typically in the top 15 in the country, sometimes higher in math and English language arts by 8th grade. So we feel very good about our educational performance, but I ground you in this because a lot of folks say, hey, I'm not really sure what the grade distribution looks like. So if you're thinking about a grading policy at OSPI, I kind of want a foundation, a framework, and that's part of the information we used as we move forward. So we'll come out of that, and I'll just walk you through some of our major principles of our grading policy and then open it up to questions. First and foremost, our policy was do no harm. We want to make sure that students have an opportunity to understand where they were when the closure occurred. We want them to have a clear understanding of what that means. So districts are reaching out to students regularly saying this is where you were relative to our expectations in a particular class around our standards. Do no harm for us means students won't move backwards. They can improve their grades by engaging their instructors and asking for additional ability to demonstrate proficiency against standards and success against those standards. So every student gets a chance over the next 8 weeks to make progress if they choose to do that. All students will be challenged, however, with continuous learning. There may be students very happy with their A or their B or their C or whatever grade their district might choose as a framework, but the expectation is that students will continue to engage in the learning because what we have told districts is you're going to pick the letter grade system that makes sense to you. Fs will not be allowed. There will be no failures this term. No student who couldn't engage or didn't get access to the learning or couldn't quite make the progress that they wanted will receive a failing grade. Instead, it will be an incomplete, and we will change our data systems at OSPI so that there's a code available to districts to provide the incomplete. It will not impact GPAs. What it means is that student either didn't get the opportunity, couldn't make the connection, or didn't make the progress that they wanted to, and that will stay open. And districts will then provide an opportunity for those students to engage down the road to improve their performance against those standards. The state as a whole, we will put a designator on all of the courses for this spring across all of our high schools across the state. They will get a COVID-19 designator. This was really important from higher education and the business community and others who said, let's mark this moment in history because everyone understands admissions next year will be impacted by this, but they might forget in 3 or 4 years that 9th graders and some 8th graders who are taking high school level work, they too were in this difficult scenario, and everyone needs a historical context when they eventually evaluate these students' transcripts, whether it's for scholarships, military work, graduate schools, undergraduate programs, a host of other reasons why we use transcripts. So we will use a statewide designator. Now, what kind of options will students have if they choose an incomplete or assigned an incomplete because they couldn't engage in the continuous learning? Well, they'll have summer school options where districts make that available. All of the available options will be locally determined. But summer school, courses in the following term may be appropriate where students missed a lot of the learning. independent study. It might be that a student just got one strand of something that didn't quite come together, and they might not need a whole quarter or a whole semester or trimester in a class, but really kind of double down on a particular learning strand within a standard. And so that will be available to them if the districts build that framework for them. Competency-based courses, we have classes that lend themselves to an assessment that demonstrates students' knowing and knowledge and ability, and then some of them are very hands-on. We have competency-based courses. Think of a welding class where a student can say, I'm going to demonstrate for you that I can deliver a perfect weld. Or a student in a construction trades program who says, I can absolutely read blueprints and I just need the ability to demonstrate that for you. So that's the kind of thing districts will create as opportunities. Online courses, of course, and then the idea of backfilling students. So they take the next most rigorous course or the next class in a sequence. And because our standards build on them and they're age and grade appropriate, it makes sense that a student who jumps into the next class, performs well in that, will simply use that grade to backfill the prior class that they were in. There will be other creative ideas of districts, and they will have broad discretion to do that. Now, let me say clearly again, what's not an option is an F. An incomplete will be a requirement of every district's grading scale, but then districts will ultimately pick their grading scale. It can be an A through a D with an incomplete. It can be an A through a C with an incomplete. It can just be an A-B option with an incomplete. And the system would allow districts, if they choose, to do an A or incomplete only. We don't anticipate a lot of districts doing that, but we know some are interested, and at least one has already adopted that. That will be up to local discretion, and they'll weigh the challenges of the difficult decision of evaluating student progress, whether that's an A or whether that's an incomplete. And a lot of incompletes, of course, will generate a lot of additional responsibility to engage those families and those students in further learning. But this is that challenge of a state office that has the legal authority to set this framework, but clearly was communicated to by the field that they wanted structure, but leave them with some decision-making to reflect their local community. And that's the balance that we tried to strike. More guidance will come to districts on this. We'll build a Q&A for them to address some of the subtleties. What about dual credit students? What about students who are already in competency-based programs? We've got answers for a lot of that, and we will build a little Q&A for them to give them more description on that. But in conclusion, we have a little over 8 weeks here to work really hard to build out this continuous learning model. I'm very proud of the state of Washington. While other states weren't really sure what to do and just punted everything locally and maybe don't have a framework at all, we said continuous learning will continue. Each district is building that plan. We are checking in with data collection every week on the performance of their plans and how they're developing them. And now we have a grading framework that will allow us to move forward. And nothing about this is perfect, and that any system we choose has inequities, but we try to draw the best interest from as many of these perspectives as we could, giving students choice, letting them move forward, do no harm, no F grades, giving them a chance to make up work later, and still honoring the fact that a lot of students told us, I've worked really hard for my grades. They matter a lot financially and with respect to future opportunities, and I don't want to lose that opportunity. So that's where we've landed, and we've notified our districts about this. The guidance went out yesterday evening, and we want to make sure that you had a chance in the media to ask us questions and really hone in on anything that you want clarification on, so we get such a consistent report of what's occurred here. 2 million parents and guardians and 1.2 million students around the state between public and the private side. They want answers to these things, and that's why we're taking extraordinary measures to be as consistent in our communication as we can with everybody and give you all a chance to now jump in with questions so that the story written in Yakima or Walla Walla or Spokane is the same in Everett or Vancouver or Seattle with respect to the facts. So with that, we will open it up to you, and I'd be really happy to answer questions on grading or anything COVID-19 and the response of schools in the state of Washington.
Kelly Oz here from K2 down in the Vancouver area. We have a question for parents out there. We've been hearing a lot of parents feeling a little bit overwhelmed or frustrated with distance learning. What do you say to them to help them kind of get through this time? They say, we're not the teachers. We don't know exactly what we're doing. What would you say to them during this time?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. It's a really powerful question. We've sure heard this a lot from folks. I think in the beginning, as districts unfolded their continuous learning plans, we just have amazing educators, and they wanted to make sure that students and families have access to a lot of resources, and we provided some of that through our guidance. And I think in the beginning, there was a want to make sure they could go as fast as they wanted to as a family or as a student. This guidance says to them, actually, we want you to be really deliberate about this. Pick a few learning standards. So it isn't about how much homework you can do. It isn't about how many chapters you can get through. A little more deliberate around the standards themselves. Try to evaluate student learning. Try to understand and engage students. And if you can really help the student demonstrate mastery of the really pertinent standards they need to have success in their next step, that's the focus. So we've heard that a lot as well. And I know it was a little bit tough in the beginning, and it will still be a little bit tough. I so much respect for parents. I've got 2 teenagers of my own who embraced it a little differently, that's for sure. Most folks didn't choose to be teachers because it's really hard work, and they had other powerful professions and skill sets they wanted to demonstrate in their lives. Tasking 2 million parents with being teachers is really hard, and that's not the goal. The goal is to guide the learning, and for the next 8 weeks, we want them to focus on fewer standards.
Hi, Amanda Broley here with CREM 2 in Spokane. Just a clarification. The Spokane Public School District has been offering 3 options for high school students, or rather seniors: pass or no credit, traditional letter grade, and then they can request a credit being waived by the principal. Do those options comply with these new guidelines, or will they have to make adjustments?
The letter grade options will be available to them. Again, they have to drop an F. There'll be no failure grades issued. There is still a waiver option at the end for seniors. That's pretty specific guidance that's been provided by the State Board of Education and an underlying waiver we have. A pass-fail or a pass-no credit is no longer an option. In the few districts around the state that we're offering that need to make the conversion on the pass to whatever grading system they adopt.
Thank you.
This is Catherine Long with the Seattle Times. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Catherine. Yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to clarify. So the students who are in K-8 grades, they'll be challenged to demonstrate effort and success in learning, but they will not receive letter grades. Is that correct?
Really great question. K-8 is going to be treated as it has in the past. Districts have already established their policies on that. They've had longstanding ability to decide that. Because the letter grades don't impact, again, if it's non-high school credit-bearing work, the letter grades or whatever grading system they have don't impact GPAs or high school transcripts. Districts will continue to do what they've done. Mostly it's a check-in and it's a comment and it's a feedback to families, and they move to another grade. By middle school, most are issuing grades, but again, not with impact. They'll continue to be able to do that as they have in the past. So middle school and elementary, hold as is, all students expected to engage in the learning. And what our state has always had as an available tool for families is if they just don't feel like their student has made appropriate progress, they work with administrators and teachers on whether or not there's some work to be made up or whether a student is held back. As you know, that does occur. So that process folds together the same as it always has for K-8.
And if I can follow up on that, I had a parent of a 5th grader who told me she had no idea if her child is meeting the curriculum because there are no grades or any real oversight by teachers, as she said. Now more than ever, grading is feedback for parents as much as for students. What would you say to parents of younger children who want a grade so they can figure out if they're doing it right?
Yeah, well, again, that is going to be that relationship locally. So districts should continue to do what they've been doing in K-8. The challenge, of course, is so many students are remote right now, and some of them are really struggling to get connectivity. So the continuous learning expectation that we establish for districts and what they have, mostly built out is contact with families, connection with families and students, feedback on the progress their students were making, and as they get through the next 8 weeks or so, giving the students opportunity to connect with learning so they can make a meaningful understanding of what they've done. And again, I think the preference and the likely outcome is that students will demonstrate proficiency against some of those key standards and we'll move them to the next grade. And then all of us are going to have to figure out strategies, particularly at the beginning of next year, to really assess where our students are and work very, very hard over time to make sure they meet our expectations.
Allison Grandy from Cairo TV here with a question for you, Chris. if there isn't going to be a pass fail, a proficient, non-proficient, what would the K through 8 kids, or especially those middle school kids who do get transcripts, what will it say?
Well, that'll be up to districts. And again, pass fail as an elimination is the high school grades. So whatever districts have been doing in K-8, they're going to continue to do. We've eliminated the pass from the high school transcript because it still has so many potential implications for students later that may be a downside. So that's the guidance on that.
Sorry, can I have a little clarification, Chris? Allison again from Cairo. So there could be pass fail in middle school. We just want to make sure we get our headlines right with this.
Yeah, but I'd encourage you to check in with school districts on what they use. We don't do a lot of letter grade stuff in elementary school. Districts use different ways to evaluate student performance in elementary schools. So the headline is that there's no change for K-8 students unless a district makes a local determination on how they want to do it. But there's no new guidance on K-8 from the state consistent with what they've been doing.
Hi, this is Suzanne with Como TV. I understand that Seattle Public Schools on Monday had voted in a new policy. For high school students, the grades would be A or I for incomplete. A lot of parents are concerned about that. How do you deal with those concerns?
Well, our grading framework that we've now established for districts will accommodate an AI system. And I know that's been an important contemplation for that district, and others may contemplate it as well. It's consistent with what we have created. Again, I don't think most districts will do that, but it'll be up to them locally to make that determination. It's consistent with the framework we've established as one of several models they might do. And Seattle School District has weighed through that carefully, as I understand, and they've taken their action. And so we don't get in the way of districts when they have complied and built a framework for their local community that reflects their local community and their local board action, as long as it's consistent with our framework, and theirs is.
Some parents, though, may say that their students work so hard and earn that A, whereas some other students don't work as hard and will be getting an A. So does that concern the school district at all, that these grades are given that way?
Well, again, as the state superintendent, we have 295 districts. We've created capacity for them to make a grading determination based on their local community. Seattle has to grapple with that, and you should definitely direct questions to Seattle. We considered all kinds of variables here at OSPI. We did not specifically say the only option is an A or an I. We gave a greater flexibility because we did hear from districts who said, we don't want that binary choice. We would rather have an A, B, or an A through C system or something like that. So we've created a little flexibility for districts. AI meets that flexibility option, but we did not pick it as the state choice. We made it available as any choice within a larger set.
This is Kelly Ozier from K2 again. Kind of a two-part question. First, any concern that high school seniors won't be prepared to go off to college with this interruption in school this year? Second part to that, if a kid is, or a senior is looking to go to an out-of-state school that maybe hasn't been hit as hard with the coronavirus as Washington State has, any concern that this could, this change in policy could hinder them from getting into those schools or attending those schools?
Yeah, so we've put a real emphasis in our priority array on seniors. It was one of the 4 initial things we told districts had to be a priority of their continuous learning plan. So we've seen amazing outreach to seniors. Again, this is hard. Some of them have struggles with connectivity, and there's definitely going to be a few gaps, but they've worked really hard. The good news about seniors is they built a long transcript already. We think this helps them. Again, we couldn't make certain that out-of-state colleges, for example, would confidently accept the pass-fail kind of binary choice. And so the letter grade option made a lot more sense. We had gotten a lot of feedback from students about that. I think higher ed across the country is going to be flexible. We all know we're in this situation. Every state is shut down. I am not concerned about students accessing higher ed in this state or out of state. Our in-state institutions have just worked really, really hard to be accommodating of our kids and our students. But there was some concern about out-of-state private schools and what happens in 3 years when maybe they think this thing's gone, but that student had been a sophomore or freshman at the time. So that's why we think the letter grade option actually makes the most sense. The incomplete allows students to come back and revisit their learning. We're focusing on seniors because they won't have time to make up an incomplete. That's why we want an intensive focus on them. But I think we're going to be incredibly effective in our state with our seniors. They're going to go on and do amazing things both in state and out of state. And I think we've set them up for the most success that we can under the framework we've built.
Can you talk?
You can go.
You think this is hard? Try having a kindergartner on Zoom for 3 hours a day.
Catherine, go ahead.
I was going to ask about high school seniors who receive incompletes. When will they get a chance to make up classes and earn diplomas? And sort of along with that, what is your thinking on summer school classes at this point?
Yeah, I don't think there'll be a lot of incompletes for seniors because, again, that's a real intensive focus for districts right now. This is not new, though. We've had seniors for a long time who have gotten right up to that graduation ceremony and didn't quite get the credit or the grade that they needed. And so there are typically programs for credit recovery over the summer or beyond. And remember also, our State Board of Education has worked really hard to adopt a credit waiver opportunity that the legislature provided right at the end of the legislative session. So the State Board of Ed has created a scenario where they know this could be a little tricky on a couple of credits for students, and there's going to be a waiver for that. They got to demonstrate a good faith effort. I mean, there's an entire framework in place that's gone to districts. Districts have already been applying for it, and so the State Board of Ed is kind of monitoring how many districts have now created this opportunity. And the waiver is actually to the district, and then they make the determination at the local building level about a particular student and the credit that they need flexibility on.
And summer school, do you think we're going to be open for summer?
Yeah, it's going to be tough because under any scenario, short of a vaccine, I think our governor and governors around the country and the president have been pretty clear that there's still going to be social distancing guidelines of some sort. So I don't anticipate a real big opportunity in anything face-to-face this summer. Again, that's going to be up to the governor, and he'll have to make some of those determinations. But it doesn't mean our districts won't continue to engage the opportunity for students who want to catch up, who want to engage in independent work. A couple of seniors who might still need that last credit will possibly have it, but it would probably still be at a distance over the summer.
Superintendent, this is Joey Thompson from the Everett Herald. And I know you said this is not a perfect scenario, and that districts have broad discretion, but there is sort of in this program the opportunity that districts that are having tougher issues getting internet access to kids may have some fall through the cracks and earn incompletes, whereas they may have, with the proper network, been able to get a passing grade. Is there any sort of backdrop that the state would be providing, or maybe an appeal of some kind, where if a student doesn't have what they need to succeed, even as the model changes over 8 weeks, they still get that incomplete, whereas in another district they may have been able to have access and get a passing grade?
Well, that's why we really avoided anything that looks like a fail or a no credit. We didn't want anything that created a permanent record for students when, to no fault of their own, they just didn't have connectivity or the supports to do the work. Again, we've got a solution for seniors of intense work and the waiver. For our 9th, 10th, and 11th graders, the incomplete becomes the equitable option because it says the student made progress or had some capacity, but maybe didn't get to the standard that the teacher thought was appropriate or the family and student thought. And that puts responsibility on the system to really give them that opportunity later on. So we see other states that haven't really come this way, and we think that that's pretty damaging to give a student an F because they couldn't engage. We're eliminating that, and I think that the incomplete is the equitable opportunity for us to re-engage, but it means we have to be really intentional about that. We have to focus on supports for those students. And we're going to be able to track the data. That's the other thing we wanted to do, is when we show you the letter grade distribution, we want you to know we can look at that by race, we can look at it by student disability, we can look at it by English language learner status and other things, and then compare that to how this year ends. We'll have a pretty good sense of the data when all this ends on whether or not this was disproportionate in one community or another, or what kind of impact that it might have had. And that allows us to target resources and expectations on districts where we know we've got to catch up with those incompletes.
We got a question from someone that is having spotty internet connection. So the question's from Janelle Retka of the Yakima Herald. She asked, you said that students will have an opportunity to make up work if they have incomplete grades at the high school level. Will this be outlined by the state later down the road? And how will the state ensure support for schools that have high levels of students that need extra support, like English learners, students with special needs, or those experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, thank you, Janelle. Sorry about your connection. The question is really, will there be additional guidance going to districts around the incomplete? So what will that framework look like for districts? And then will there be additional supports? The guidance will be really quite open here. Again, our state statutes are about us establishing a framework for credits and transcripts, but districts make decisions on who teaches, what their offerings are going to be, what master schedules they build. Districts will navigate what incomplete looks like in terms of the opportunity to recover and to engage in the learning. We're going to be really flexible with this because it is about standards. So it's about meeting standards. It's not saying go back and make sure that if you miss 7 chapters in U.S. history, you get through all those chapters. It's not about the content as much as it is, did the student demonstrate, were they able to demonstrate key concepts in science or math or English language arts or physical ed or something? And then educators are making a determination of whether they will have success at the next step. So I feel pretty good about that. Districts have always had targeted resources for some of our targeted populations of students, and they're going to be even more focused on those. We are getting federal relief dollars. The initial wave of this will be about $200 million statewide for our districts. That only represents about 1.5% of all of our resource in the state, but it is pretty timely in that it will come at a time when districts have already incurred some COVID-19 expenses, and they're already documenting the needs to support more intensely some of these student groups who may be disproportionately impacted by the closure and connectivity. So the good news is there's a little federal money coming, and we expect districts will deploy that to really have support for students. And I know our legislature is already thinking about what next fall looks like in the next year and the subsequent years. And I understand Congress is still working on additional potential stimulus type money with a focus on K-12 and higher ed, even after they just did a round of it. So lots of opportunities coming for districts.
Chris, can you talk a little bit more about what scenarios you're gaming out for the for coming back to school this fall? Have you talked at all about coming back early when I know we've all probably read that there's some concern that we'll have a new wave of COVID and flu cases this fall, and it could disrupt everything all over again in an even worse way. I have heard that there are some colleges talking about coming to start school early in the summer so that if they then have to go online later, they're available to do that. What's your thinking right now about what school will look like this fall?
Well, the governor certainly has the authority on our face-to-face model. He gets to make that emergency determination and declaration about the timeliness of our return. And I know he's going through those contemplations now, mostly in the private economy and what that return looks like. He's got experts who are advising him on epidemiology. So what does the curve look like? What does the spread look like? We've obviously got one of the greatest universities literally on planet Earth, the University of Washington, and their virologists kind of helping build models around this. So the science will mostly dictate that, but to the extent that we are already thinking about it, we have been tasked with, what are all the menu of options look like? If we can come back, but we have to be socially distanced, well, we're starting some contemplation with the Emergency Management Division, and then eventually that will be with a bunch of school leaders who really know their buildings and their teaching and learning models. Do we focus on K-8 in our buildings with social distancing and maybe have our high school students be more independent? Do we do staggered schedules? We're thinking through all of those models, and it's too early to make any of those determinations at all, but we're already starting to think about that. And what did China do? What did South Korea do? What is Italy doing as they try to come back, in France? And this is a global response right now and a global reaction, and hopefully we can be super informed where others had to go first and struggle with it. But the science will drive the governor for sure. We'll give him contemplation and consideration on the learning side of it. And there's a two-step process, which is knowing the science and its impacts and then getting our education experts to continue to give us guidance and recommendation on what they might be able to do. Too early to determine right now, but we are already in that contemplation. Any other questions from folks?
Oh, I
Well, if there
did.
are not, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one more question. The money you were talking about that's going to be coming from Congress from the stimulus, will that help school districts pay for emergency services they're providing right now, like computers and childcare? Is that part of that?
Yeah. So the dollar amount is a little over $200 million for our state for K-12. Higher ed has its own access to its own resources as well. 90% of that money will go out to school districts by formula, and they will have significant discretion on how to address the response here. Some of it will be to reimburse for costs incurred, food, nutrition, childcare, continuous learning, hardware they've supplied families, or they need to keep supplying families connectivity directly for families. Districts are going to get quite a bit of ability to deploy those resources. Again, our goal here is to understand the moment we're in, do a lot of identification of where we need to shore up supports for students, and then deploy our state and federal resources to get them successful. I just don't intend for our students to be long-term impacted by this from a learning standpoint. We are all going through something right now, emotionally, sometimes our health. There's a lot of trauma around this and a lot of challenge. But we have systems that we can build to shrink those learning gaps and to put ourselves back on the path that we were on in terms of success. But broad discretion for districts. I will say that we have accountability back to the feds, so we've got to do a little work here at the state level to make sure districts can report to us in categories how they're spending that money, so you will all have high visibility as they expend those dollars on what's going on there. But that's the opportunity that we have, and we expect districts will deploy that with real intentional focus on student success. Reach out as you need to. If you have follow-up questions, as always, Katie Payne is our communications director and always happy to accommodate additional information for you all. We will do this periodically if this is an interest of yours. You've gotten the same information today that we have shared with our administrative teams. I have a weekly conversation with educators. They will get the same information. Our goal has been to be as transparent about the decisions that are coming and the contemplations that are before us. And then as we get to those decisions, to get them on paper, get them as formal guidance or rule changes, to post those on the OSPI webpage under our COVID section, and then to follow up with any questions people have, so that together we are moving as a state with at least an understanding of the policy framework and the limitations, and then doing what we do best, which is deploying the expectations of our districts to take that framework and build meaning for students and families and learning. So thanks for being on this. Thanks again to any educators watching. I know it's being live streamed by some folks, so we really thank you for your continued focus here. Let's do what Washington does, which is lead and get better and focus on growth over the next 8 weeks, and have an intentional expectation that we're going to